Welcome to the Gospel According to Star Trek podcast. I'm Kevin C. Neese.
And I'm David Atwell, and you're listening to episode 80, Mirrors and Whistlespeak. We'll start off with some Star Trek trivia.
And then we'll get into our audience question right after our main topic discussing Star Trek Discovery, Season 5, Episode 5, Mirrors, and Season 5, Episode 6, Whistlespeak. There's a lot to talk about in these episodes. We really enjoyed them. We hope you enjoy ours. Stay with us. Okay, so we are back, David, yet again. For another of these, good to be here for another one of these extended episodes. We're just doing this now. This is fun.
Hey, it's not a bad thing to reinvent yourself.
It's not. It's even if you do it by accident, it's fine. Yep. So good. Well, how have you been doing? Doing okay?
I've got my voice back.
Yay! It's good to hear your voice, your real voice.
Yes, I agree. And thank you to the audience for bearing with me last time. Everything is going great now that I'm able to talk again.
That's good. You did great last week, by the way. That was very impressive fortitude to get through that episode.
Yep.
So yeah.
Hey,
cool. Yeah.
Speaking of, things that we both know about, do you have any Star Trek trivia for us?
Well, yes, actually, surprisingly, I do have trivia questions for us to answer. Are you prepared? Are you prepared for the gauntlet?
Ooh, I think I'm ready.
Okay, as usual, selected by our own Mike Poteet. We have not seen these questions, nor have we seen the answers. Mike has hidden them from us in a separate email. So anyway, here we go. All right, so first question.
Okay.
This is an original series question.
Okay.
A female member of what species first appears in the original series episode Day of the Dove? Okay. Go ahead and... You got your answer ready?
I do.
Okay. All right. Next. How does Commander Riker realize he is not really in the future in the Next Generation episode Future Imperfect?
Okay.
Okay. I went into a little bit of detail there. Okay, last question. Which actor played the grandfather of his Star Trek The Next Generation character in The Undiscovered Country?
Which actor, you say?
Actor played the grandfather of his Next Generation character.
All right.
All right. You good?
I'm ready.
Okay. All right. So we have our answers. We will look at those at the end of the episode, see which one of us wins the golden self-sealing stem bolt.
The self-stealing symbol is invented by the Ferengi, I believe.
Yes. It's also known as the auto-absconding
right, there you go. I like
stem bolt.
Yep.
I was trying to come up with another A word for stem bolt, but what's a stem bolt? Anyway. We don't know what it is, but we know it when we see it.
Right, exactly. Yep. Well, obviously it's a stem bolt that seals itself, right?
And true. And I mean, as opposed to, I guess, a stem bolt that doesn't. I don't guess anybody really uses those anymore, though. It's pretty much the self-sealing kind.
Right.
True. I mean, why would you want to go through having to seal a stem bolt, for goodness sakes?
Yeah.
That's archaic.
Right. I haven't sealed my own stem bolts since high school.
In ages. I know, right?
This makes sense to somebody, I'm sure.
This makes sense to us. I don't know. Oh, boy. Let's see. Okay, good. So we got our Star Trek trivia set up. And I guess we can start talking about our episodes, yeah?
Let's do it.
Okay. Season 5, Episode 5, Mirrors. Tell me your thoughts on this episode.
Man, I had a lot of thoughts about both of these episodes. Now, neither of them are my favorite. I thought they were both good,
Right.
like really good.
But no time loops, so you're basically checking out.
Right, exactly, yeah. But I do think both of them were very deep and rich in like just things to think about.
Definitely.
So I thought that was really just really impressive. Just how much here in this last season they're really just packing these things, just stacking them deep with ideas and thoughts. And I really thought that this was a really tightly wound episode. I found a couple of issues with it, but generally speaking, I've been annoyed by recent Star Trek's obsession with the mirror universe, but this sort of felt different because I mean, partially because we didn't see any mirror universe characters, but also partially because we're seeing the results of something that happened in the mirror universe, which I think makes it compare quite favorably to something like the Deep Space Nine mirror universe episodes, which I thought was great. I thought that was really an interesting take on something that could be a tired formula.
Yeah, I was really interested, when we were recording the show last time, and you said the name of the episode was Mirrors. It didn't occur to me until I was editing that I was like, oh, Mirrors, Discovery, Mirror Universe episode. I mean, when do we have the word mirror in an episode title since the original series that we don't go into the Mirror Universe? And so I thought, oh, well, we're going to have a Mirror Universe episode. And I was like, okay, that's cool. I mean, that makes sense. Discovery has spent a lot of time in the Mirror Universe. Mirror Universe was very important, especially in the first season.
Right.
It's part of our history. So it makes sense that we're doing this in the last season. And so I was expecting to just fully go into the Mirror Universe, and we didn't, and that was surprising. And to the point that it was like, oh, why is it the ISS Enterprise? Why is that the case?
I have some ideas on that, but first, I mean, you mentioned like Discovery's history with the Mirror Universe, and also I think the Star Trek franchise's future in the Mirror Universe, or with a Mirror Universe person at least, in George O. I do think it's interesting to point out Michelle Yeoh was just awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is really
that's amazing. Cool. Yes, that's very cool. I saw that earlier this week, and that's pretty incredible. I don't know what specifically. I didn't see the ceremony or anything. I need to go watch the ceremony because I don't know specifically what she was awarded for, right? If it was a particular part of her career overall, everything everywhere all at once, that sort of thing. I'm not sure, but it's really cool to see that. Yeah, it was awesome.
Well, so the White House blurb says Michelle Yeoh is an actress known for her groundbreaking work in a number of blockbusters over 4 decades. Recently, she became the first Asian to win the Academy Award for Best Actress.
Yay!
So, and it says Yeoh continues to shatter stereotypes and enrich American culture. So it seems like it's just a lifetime achievement award as an actress and as sort of a barrier breaker for Asian representation, which is fantastic.
She absolutely is, and that's marvelous. So very cool. Yep. That's like the reason to look forward to the Section 31.
Yes,
series.
I agree. The entire reason is indeed Michelle Yeoh for me. Yep.
I guess it's a movie, not a series now. It's a movie. So. Oh
yeah, good point.
Unless this is a backdoor, not a backdoor, but unless this is a pilot, we'll see.
Right.
Yeah.
Who knows? Who is at the wheel making these decisions at Paramount? But you asked why the Mirror Universe? Why is this the Mirror Universe? And I have some thoughts on that. I think this goes again to the topic of identity and legacy that we've sort of seen played out over the course of, this season in particular. I feel like they had the opportunity to talk about this in previous seasons, and maybe we touched on it a little bit right after they got to the 32nd century and Burnham pulled up the file on Spock. But specifically here we're talking about, we're talking about Spock. It's the first time that we've really talked about the legacy of a character that the Discovery crew knew in their time. Mirror Spock is brought up, and it's mentioned. I'm sure he was just as ruthless as the rest of them. We're talking about the question of identity and legacy, and we get this understanding that the change that came over Mirror Universe Spock as a result of his experience with Kirk during Mirror Mirror, has apparently left a very lasting effect and caused some pretty major changes. We had this ISS Enterprise essentially doing Federation work in the Mirror Universe, apparently. So that's a really exciting and really cool thing to know that actually happened as a result of what happened in that episode. And as much as I wanted to see like a video of Ethan Peck as Mirror Spock, I thought that would have been a lot of fun. I was really impressed with their restraint at like leaving it just sort of told in dialogue, and we are given a little bit of evidence as to what has happened in the Mirror Universe, a little bit of a story about the sort of future beyond or between, I guess, the original series Mirror Universe and the DS9 Mirror Universe. But it was just really nice to sort of see how that went.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was very cool, and I love the fact that we're interacting. We've never quite interacted with the Mirror Universe in this sort of way, to just kind of have a Mirror Universe artifact that plays this role in a Prime Universe story. Right. It was really interesting and really cool. I think it is interesting because there is something sort of about mirrors in the episode, because there's a lot about faces and appearance and what we show and what we don't show. Yeah. And when we look like one another and when we don't look like one another. Seeing ourselves in one another. Maul and Locke seeing themselves in one another. Mm-hmm. Michael and Book seeing themselves in Maul and Locke and trying to mirror them back to each other, to mirror Maul and Locke back to themselves and say, hey, we're like you. We have a story like yours. And even that mirror of the first Cleveland Booker, right? Or the previous Cleveland Booker, I should say. Right. And the current Cleveland Booker. You know, and him trying to echo back to Maul in a certain sense, yes, these things were bad about what happened because of your father or what your father did in your life. However, let me give you more details about that image. So all of that, to me, mirrors, plural, it's not just the Mirror Universe and the Mirror Enterprise. I feel like there's a lot of reflection going on between characters and within characters, within themselves. And even that reflection, too, when Michael and Book are talking, and she says one of the surprises in the time jumps was you, when and we were happy. Right. And that difference between ourselves and this reflected version of ourselves, this echo of ourselves. And can we get back to that version of ourselves? It's all very introspective about where we are and where we could go and where we have been and where we find ourselves in one another. And so I found that fascinating.
It is fascinating. And I mean, you sort of were dancing around the faces of people like the Breen, right? We see their faces for the first time. Since they were mentioned apparently in TNG season 4, which that was a long time ago for us to just never see their faces. But it also like the mirrors and the fact that we're sort of seeing alternate universe versions of or hearing stories of alternate universe versions of our characters, not just in the fact that they, like as you're mentioning, not just in the Mirror Universe, but also like you said, Maul and Locke are kind of alternate universe versions of Burnham and Book. Right. But I think it also maybe this is part of why I liked this episode as a Mirror Universe adjacent episode more than a lot of the ones that I've seen. It's because they had hope and they found freedom despite impossible odds, which I think somebody says that in the episode. That was really showing somebody winning in the Mirror Universe. Sorry, not somebody, but showing good winning in the Mirror Universe. Not just escaping, not just sort of surviving, but good actually winning. And they did escape and they did survive, but they were doing things, right? They were doing things to try to alleviate suffering and to make things better, which I thought was just a really interesting spin on the Mirror Universe, and I was really excited to see that. Yeah, we talk a lot about hope in Star Trek. Yeah.
And we talk a lot about hope on this podcast, which makes sense. Hope is, one of the three that remain: faith, hope, and love.
Right.
According to Paul. And I've said in the past, that Paul says the greatest of these is love. And I don't want to disagree necessarily, although, hey, you're free to disagree, even with Paul. But there are times, I think, when hope is perhaps more essential or more necessary. Like, we can't have love for ourselves or for someone else without hope. But hope... So hope, there's this idea of hope that we talk about a lot that is sort of like an idealism, if you will, sort of like a sense that things are going to get better. But one of the things that we have to understand about hope is that it functions best. It does its job when it leads to action. One of the things about Star Trek that I love, especially from a gospel perspective, is the idea that the future doesn't get better just because time goes on.
Right.
The future gets better because people work hard to make it better.
Uh-huh.
And we have struggles and we have problems. Even in the 32nd century, we almost lose the Federation. And we're right now on the cusp of losing the Federation. We've seen, in previous episodes where, we could lose everything. So we have to constantly work. We have to constantly have that. We think of faith as like this set of beliefs that you have, or this idea that you have about something beyond yourself that you connect to, or confidence that something beyond yourself is going to, pluck you out of suffering and save you.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it is important to know that while faith includes ideas about divine rescue and intervention, while faith includes things about beliefs and values and all those things, that incorporated into that necessarily is faithfulness. And that is a diligence in carrying out the things that hope tells us lie in the future.
Oh, I
because
like that.
The hope that we have is the hope that we are co-creators with God in this project. That the universe, of all the, we've talked on the show before about how I believe evolution is such a great indicator of the existence of God because of what a beautiful system it is. But we are the only creatures on this planet who can adjust it. We're the only ones who can actively be involved in what happens with evolution. We can change our own DNA. We can change the DNA of others. We can do things actively through horticulture and whatever other means to change things intentionally on this planet.
And we can decide that we're not going to be bound by the cruelty of survival of the fittest.
Yes.
We're going to allow people to continue on, even if it makes us genetically, maybe, I don't know, that this is getting a little close to eugenics for my liking, but even if it doesn't make any biological sense, we've decided that we still are stronger as a people with everyone.
Yes.
And I like that a lot.
And that is the antithesis of eugenics, because eugenics says we're going to make our species better by getting rid of all faults and flaws and everything, And if you've seen Gattaca, you understand how horrible that sense of vision is, and you understand why eugenics is outlawed in the Federation, in Star Trek. So it's exactly that. It's having that power and then also having responsibility. Yes, Spider-Man, whatever. But that co-creative role, right, is really important for us. And we have to remember that we are, by God's design, participants in the hope that we have.
Well, and it's interesting that you're bringing that up in this season of Discovery, in particular, since they're looking for the progenitor's tech that seeded all of the galaxy with life. They are in a very real way going to be participating in creation if they use that. They're going to be participating in creation even if they don't, because they're going to be choosing to to leave that power untasted, I suppose might be
right.
another way of putting it. When you were talking about, potentially disagreeing with Paul about faith, hope, and love, I wonder if, and you kind of got to this, so let me just see if this maybe summarizes what you were talking about. That faith, hope, and love are not as distinct as maybe the popular understanding of that verse is. That faith, hope, and love, he's saying these three remain, and the greatest of these is love. I wonder if maybe love is the greatest, not in quality, but in size. That it is the greatest because it's the most visible. It's the one that we express maybe the most. But faith is just love projected onto another person, right? Love projected onto what a person's character is and how much we trust that person. And hope is just love projected into the future, and love for another, or for people in general, or for the way that we could be. And I think all of those things might really be tied together, because love is just the quality of having faith and hope in another, right? And so I think all of those things are just sort of different aspects of the same way of relating to another person. Right. And so I think that we separate those things a lot of times in Western churches, but I don't necessarily know that they need to be separated, because I think that a right understanding of the way that God intends for us to be in community and to be acting as a people who have each other's best interests at heart, and to love deeply and to hope fiercely and to have faith not just in him but in the way that he has composed the universe to be. I think that all of that goes together to be a really much more unified way of looking at that verse in particular, but at God's creation in general. And so I don't know that necessarily you have to disagree with Paul to have that outlook on things.
That's a great way to look at it, and I really appreciate you saying that, because I've said that for years, and I think you're right. And I think it's not a disagreement with Paul so much as it is a disagreement with our interpretation of that idea, which is that the greatest of these is love means that the most essential of these is love. And sometimes I feel like, and yes, I think the greatest is love because God is love. Therefore, love is greater than anything. Right. Love is at the core of everything. Right. So there's that. But then also it's like the way I've thought about it is, okay, well, but sometimes the only thing we have is hope. And I feel like we can't have love without hope, and all that sort of thing. But that's just my own perspective. And definitely, the interdependence and the interrelationship of those things is really important, and that faith and hope are a part of the project of love, right? It's like in Data's day when Data says, if being human is more than simply a matter of being born flesh and blood, if it is instead a way of acting, thinking, and feeling, then I'm hopeful that I'll one day discover my own humanity. But until then, I will continue learning, changing, growing, and trying to become more than what I am. And in learning, changing, growing, and trying to become more than what he is, Data is already involved in the project of being human. Yeah. So in the same way as the way you're talking about it here is that by having faith or by having hope, we're already involved in the project of love. I think that's great.
Yeah.
Cool.
And I think that Tilly even sort of suggests that maybe when she's talking to Culber in the bar at the end of the episode. First of all, I love seeing her as sort of this confidant, almost the teacher that you really wish you had, right? And she is a teacher, right? But you're seeing her as that. But she's talking to Culber, and she says they're not really that far apart, the intellectual and the spiritual. Both reach for understanding. Both bring us to new places. And I think that the way that she's sort of expressing this idea of the connection between the intellectual and the spiritual, it's a very similar thing to the way that faith, hope, and love are related. They're not entirely different. The intellectual and the spiritual are just two ways of exploring who God is. We can explore him intellectually, thinking about him. We can explore him spiritually by experiencing him, right? Experientially, right? We can explore him intellectually by exploring his creation, and we can explore him spiritually by experiencing new experiences among other people. There are all of these different facets to what is essentially the same pursuit. In the case of what Paul is saying, faith, hope, and love, that sense of love and that sense of engaging with the real world as God created it, and in what Tilly is talking about, that sense of wanting to know more about God or about the universe or about whatever your conception of in Star Trek, at least, whatever your conception of what is sort of transcendent is. And so I thought that was a really beautiful way of, even if they weren't necessarily trying to cap off the entire story, I thought it was a really beautiful way of sort of capping off that whole story.
Yeah, and that in that conversation, she says that. I'm glad you took down that dialogue. She says that, and then Culber just kind of has a moment. He's like, "Well, I didn't say anything. I didn't say spiritual, And she's like, "Yeah, you kind of did."
Right. Yeah.
Which
exactly.
I love that, because all of this stuff that they're talking about, in Culber's journey and all of this, we're hopping around the episode like madmen, but whatever.
Sure.
But all of this stuff they're talking about with Culber's journey of like finding something that's greater than ourselves and greater than all of us, right? And the spiritual dimension and all of that, and we'll get into more of that in the next episode. But in this conversation that Culber and Tilly are having, it's not unlike other conversations that have existed in Star Trek already. It's really not, and it's a thing that has been said in Star Trek in multiple ways. Perhaps not this explicitly sometimes. Sometimes, yes, this explicitly, but it's really fascinating to see this very this very explicit spiritual quest or spiritual opening of oneself in a way that we've seen, but without necessarily. Sometimes we give it that name, sometimes we don't, but it's there. And to understand also, like you say, that it's a part of it. One of the things that was most profound for me, I've talked before about my professor and mentor, Dr. David Noggle. I did the book, The Good, the True, the Beautiful, in his honor. I co-edited that book in his honor. And one of the things that he taught me that changed my whole view of education and why I was sitting in a college classroom seat was that I was there not just to get a degree to hang on the wall to give it a job, but that that intellectual pursuits are necessarily spiritual pursuits.
Yeah.
And if I view them otherwise, I'm actually draining them of their full meaning, their full potential. If my intellectual pursuits are just about this achievement mentality, that we have in the way we do education, I'm missing the whole point. Because learning, as we talked about with data, learning, changing, and growing, trying to become more than what we are, that's all one pursuit of growth. That's all one pursuit. And so education is about who I become as a person.
Right.
Through the process of the learning, not am I going to use this in my job? Right. If all I can think of is this utilitarian function for what I've got, I am missing the point. And I think between Hugh and Paul, they both have a sense of something greater, of something deeper that is involved in their scientific pursuits, and in their quests for discovery.
You're talking this time about Paul Stamets.
Yes. Sorry. Not the Apostle Paul. You and Paul, the couple. But because Paul is searching for something that will give him meaning. He is searching for something that will give him identity. And like you say, legacy. Those are intangible things. Right. Those are things that are not, on that much vaunted, very misguided hierarchy of needs. Those are things that are less concrete than winning an award. I mean, he's definitely looking for concrete achievement. But in looking for that concrete achievement, Paul is also looking for some way to reach beyond himself.
Yeah.
Reach beyond the end of his own lifespan into the future, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that is in itself a spiritual quest. He doesn't understand it in the way Hugh does. And when Hugh explains what he's experiencing to Paul, Paul doesn't quite get it. And we see that, we see him just go very nerdy and very intellectual with it. And Paul's just like, you didn't quite get there. And I mean, I think a lot of us have had those conversations with our spouses where we're going somewhere and they're not there for one reason or another. And we have to have multiple conversations. That's what relationship is about. Sometimes communication takes a lot more conversation, a lot more investment, a lot more work. And sometimes that is for the health of the relationship. Sometimes it's just so we understand one another. But the point is, I think Hugh and Paul might be closer to one another than Hugh currently sees.
Right.
Paul doesn't see the distance. Hugh does. But I think Hugh might be a little hung up on the particulars without recognizing that Paul is on a similar journey, without calling it by the same name, which I think is part of being human.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. For sure.
And it's part of why we do science. We don't do science. Science is, when you get down to it, doing science is a lot of like computing. It's like a lot of drudgery and math. And people don't do that because they love, just crunching numbers, and that's just cool.
Right.
I mean, you have to enjoy some of that, but you're doing it for a purpose. And if you're not doing it for a larger purpose, you're probably not going to have the wherewithal to stick with it.
Right.
So, yeah.
Definitely.
Anyway, so what else do we want to talk about in this episode?
Well, so we got a confirmation that Commander Rayner is indeed a Kelleran.
Yes.
And we got a little bit of Kelleran culture.
Yes, that was nice. And I love that Michael has done her research on his culture.
Yes.
That
tracks for me very much with Michael's character, but we haven't seen it until now.
Yes, and that's right. We really haven't, and because we haven't had the opportunity. True. But that's she had those conversations early on in the season with Rayner about sort of learning your people, and I don't know that it had occurred to him until now that she was doing that kind of learning work with him. Mm-hmm. And that's great in that conversation that they have when she was going to give him the con and he's like, oh, I don't know about this. This mission is too dangerous. I should go, yada, yada. And she basically boils it down to, how long has it been since you took the con from somebody? And he's like, a long time. And he's like, you're going to do fine.
Right.
You can do it. I trust you, And so that kind of knowledge of him, and then to do that work to try to understand his culture without actually asking him for it. This is something that a lot of people in marginalized communities talk about, that in their circles of people who are not a part of their marginalized community, whether they're queer people or they're people of a marginalized race or whatever, they often are spoken to by people in their lives who are not in that community in ways where they're supposed to represent their whole community. They're supposed to tell their whole story. They're supposed to unpack all their trauma, like they're supposed to always like be the answer person. And it's like, would you just try like maybe doing some research on your own?
Right.
Instead of just like taxing me all the time with being the person to have all your answers for you.
The emotional labor.
The emotional labor, exactly. And so I love that Michael has shown that kind of investment in Rayner by, seeking to understand him without pushing him, especially because of the awkward situation that he's in. Without drilling him for information, she's gone to the trouble to invest. That's an act of love. I've got to say, that's an act of love, and I think it's beautiful. It's an act of respect, too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And, especially as we're sort of seeing, or as we did see, rather, as we saw Captain Rayner, or Commander Rayner, rather, sort of not extending that same respect to the crew earlier on in his sort of I guess the beginning of episode 3 or so, when he was saying, tell me your deal in 20 words or less or whatever.
Right.
That the fact that Burnham has gone to such the opposite extreme, right? Is just, I think, we're sort of seeing Commander Raynor's entire, I don't know, commanding style, I feel like, kind of get rewritten in real time, which is pretty cool to see.
Yeah.
But it also, I think, underscores a lot about how this show is very opinionated about what good leadership looks like.
Yeah.
And I think that's an interesting way of expressing it, because you're right. She did all of that, but they didn't put it on the screen. We did not see her, holding a pad with Kelleran culture on it, or asking people for what is the name of, or she wasn't asking the Zora to pull up a hologram of the Ballad of Krull or anything like that. Right. The whole thing, it feels like it's just part of the way that she does things, and it's not made a big deal of. It's just this is how good leadership is according to Star Trek Discovery and according to Burnham, and that's just the way that it works out. And I love that it doesn't get preachy.
Yeah, agreed. And good leadership is at the heart of Star Trek. It's one of the things that Star Trek talks about the most. Yeah. And that is most important. There's a whole book on leadership that's called "Make It So." It's written by Jean-Luc Picard, whatever.
Right.
And and it's using episodes to illustrate leadership skills. And yes, I think Star Trek does have Star Trek in general. I mean, this series, you're right, but then also Star Trek in general, because it has a point of view about what good leadership is. Right. But it's important to note that view of what good leadership is not about style. It's about ethos. So that some people have compared Raynor to like Jellicoe, where he comes in with a completely different style that really makes people uncomfortable. But if you give him a minute, he actually knows what he's doing.
Right.
And certainly in Raynor's case, he's got some things to learn, but he's got some things to teach too. And as he learns to give a little bit in terms of his relationship with the crew, they can then trust him when his style is very different. And we saw that in this episode. I just loved the way the crew functioned under Raynor in this episode. I thought it really showed his strengths, not because Michael has taught him how to be a good leader, right? But because she has given him the authority and the permission to be the kind of leader he is. And he can lean into his own style within the context of the ethos of Discovery, right? And with that grounding of what it means to bring people along with you and not push them down. And it works beautifully, and he's fantastic. I'm loving him more every episode.
Yep. I am also, I'm glad I remember early on I made the suggestion that the Kellerans are a very black and white species, right? They were the ones that pursued O'Brien and Bashir, trying to kill them because they knew about this virus. And I'm glad that has not become an issue, because as I was thinking back about it, I feel like that would have been there would have been a lot of, like, I don't know, racial essentialism wrapped up in that. Like, you cannot change if you are like this. And the fact that he is able to change is, I think, a really telling thing, again, about the ethos of Star Trek. And we've already seen that. We saw that all the way back in Next Generation when we had Worf on the bridge, right? And so all of this really underscores and sort of hammers home the reality that you are not set in stone. Your personality isn't, your style isn't, the way you are can change, and you can grow. And I'm learning a lot about that for myself just over the past couple of months. I'm really, really pleased to see a lot more of that being delved into within the Star Trek stories that we're seeing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very, I think that's, I think a lot in Star Trek about the theme of conviviality. And I think that's so important right now.
Yes.
For so many of us, we've lost the sense of conviviality and living in a way that lets everyone flourish. I say we've lost. There are movements and ways of thinking that have lost that. And they're now, and that issue is being forced on a lot of us.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that there are a lot of people who don't want to live in a convivial culture, but
Don't want to live in a culture at all sometimes.
that's really true. And
They just want to be themselves, just individuals.
right. And there's a sense that if you cooperate with others or kind of get along with the getting along, right?
Mm-hmm.
That you're going to lose yourself,
Right.
or lose your culture, or lose your identity. And that's not what conviviality is about. That's not what an inclusive society is about. The only thing that an inclusive society cannot include is exclusivism.
Right.
If you're exclusionary, okay, we can't include your exclusion, right? Because that's not how this works.
Uh-huh.
But if you can learn to be inclusive, then you can be whoever you are. You can hold whatever beliefs you hold. You can think whatever thoughts you think. You just have to learn to cooperate with others in a way that is respectful and doesn't try to control how other people live their lives.
Mm-hmm.
That's how we get along.
Right.
And you can still, and I mean, Worf is a great example of somebody who did not, he was criticized in Next Generation for being too human and all that sort of thing. But he grew further into being a Klingon. He grew deeper into what it means to be a Klingon.
Uh-huh.
In no small part because of the Starfleet folks supporting him in that process.
Right.
Because they didn't view him as an enemy based on his differences. They viewed him as someone to learn from and someone to care about. Even if they didn't ultimately agree with his point of view on things, they still wanted to give him space to be who he is. And so as he learned to give other people space, as he learned to flex and bend when he needed to, he was also given that same room. And that's how it works.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, speaking of racial essentialism, though, it does appear that a racial trait of Ferengi is that they tend to bar, and that a racial trait of Lurians is that they sit at bars.
This is true. This is true. I guess that was Zorn we were seeing on the, the pitch there, or Quarn. Actually, I'm not sure.
We don't know what the lifespan of a Lurian might be. That might be Morn.
That could be Morn. Dude, that's crazy.
That would be pretty impressive. He just decided to join the Federation?
Hey, he's done everything else. Why not?
Yeah, exactly.
That's fascinating.
But speaking of races, what did you think of the Breen? 34 years, we've never seen a Breen face before. And it turns out they're liquid.
Right. Or something, right?
Or something.
Whatever that is.
Yeah.
It's no matter what came out from under that helmet, it's not going to be like, oh, that's exactly what they should look like. It's just going to be whatever it is.
Uh-huh.
And it's interesting. So I guess the thing that I'm deriving from this is that there is this sort of liquidy form that they have.
Uh-huh.
And then there's also this more solid form that they can take, and somehow they denigrate that solid form. They don't like, the kind of face that Locke shows when he's got his helmet off.
Uh-huh.
And I'm still curious about the helmets too. Maybe that helps them hold their gooey faces together. I don't know. But he's having a conversation with Maul, and he says about his other face. He says, "It's not me," and she says, "But it's a part of you, right? Both faces are."
Mm-hmm.
And it's later on in their relationship, after time has passed, that he says to his uncle, Both faces are part of us. If we deny half our nature, we deny it all.
Uh-huh.
And I found that fascinating.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that recently, because I have had issues over my life with different things that I sort of feel like are bad. Things like having a temper. And one of the things that I've been learning over the past couple of months is that part of the reason that I'm mad at those sort of sides of me is because I feel like they're at odds with the values that I kind of want to hold as a person, as a human, as me, right?
Yeah.
I like, for instance, my anger. I want to have. I feel like I have this sort of stated value of not wanting to be irrational, not wanting to be to impose myself upon others. And so, what is this anger but irrationality, or me imposing my will upon others? But as I've come to discover recently, when I'm angry, when I find myself provoked to anger, a lot of times it's because there's an injustice. Now, in fairness, not all the time, but a lot of times it is. And so when I started to realize that, I did feel a lot like Locke when he's sort of having this feeling of his two forms not really being, his two faces not really being, I don't know, one being more real than the other. I feel like my intellectual side is more real than my emotional side. And when I'm able to sort of reconcile those two things, my intellectual side and my more emotional side, I feel like more of a complete person. And I thought that was really it was really interesting and almost deft of the way that they introduced the Breen as the sort of like, they are only this one thing, and to show the other thing is not the real them. But Locke is saying, no, I'm both, and I think that makes him healthier for it. And I thought that was a really interesting way for them to show something that frankly is really important, and I don't think that I've even explored enough of to be able to talk about it really honestly. I think I probably have said something incomprehensible, but I think that it was really interesting that they put this. Not only did they put this into the series, but they also put this into the voice of the villain of this season, which is pretty impressive.
Yeah, and again, I'm feeling less and less like Mullen and Locke are really villains. We keep calling them that, but I said this a couple episodes ago. I don't know that they're really villains. I feel like they are, and I love this about Star Trek, is that it doesn't at its best label people like that, and even our worst villains, you can understand why they got the way they are, even if they're doing something terrible. But here, I think there's definitely the sense, especially with Book's relationship with Maul and all of that, and with Maul and Locke's relationship with one another and the real love that we see between them. It's not about, hey, I want to be this horrible person and I want to hurt people. It's about, I just want freedom for myself and the person I love to go and be us away from people who tell us we can't be us. And
they have hope that it can happen.
And they have hope
that it can happen. In each other to be able to get there.
Exactly, right. And that's I think then it becomes understandable, right?
Yeah.
And I think there are a lot of people in the world who are vilified for doing things that they do out of desperation because they're in a position that we privileged folks are not in. And we can look at them and say, oh, but they broke the law and rah, and get really mad about whatever. And it's like, yeah, but look at how the system is rigged to make life impossible for these people. Look at how the system is rigged so that they don't really have the option of following the law because you've made it cost too much money or whatever it is, right? How are they supposed to live? So people who are sort of sucked up into an unjust system in which they are privileged have the hardest time seeing the injustice of that system. And so people like Maul and Locke, I think, are really beautiful images for us of folks, especially Locke, folks who don't fit within a system that was not designed for their flourishing, but was designed for an order that somebody else imagined.
Yeah.
And by simply not flourishing within that order, they're vilified because of who they are, because of what they need, because of what they want, because of what makes them whole.
Yeah.
And again, in a convivial society, in a place where we're seeking flourishing, in shalom, in ultimate shalom, which is the peace of the full reign of God, right?
Mm-hmm.
The wholeness of creation, we have that ability,
Right,
to be whoever
yes.
it is we are in full
Yes.
freedom along with all of our neighbors. And that's when we see people who run up against the limitations of our systems of order, I think it's very important to look for the glimmers of shalom trying to break through.
Yeah.
Look for the things that they need and the things that they want that we also need and want deep in our own hearts. And we might have it provided to us more easily than they do because we're in a privileged position. And so recognizing privilege helps us to understand the humanity of those who don't have it. And because when we don't recognize privilege and we think, well, this is just the way things are, to quote, get that reference. If you just think that this is the way things are and it's fine because it benefits me, you don't recognize the humanity of other people who don't fit the system, and you just vilify them for not fitting the system. And so, I don't know. You were making a point about about Locke, and I kind of went sideways.
No, I think that's exactly right, because what you're talking about with that final in the kingdom we will be our true and complete and fully realized selves. At our best, the different pieces of ourselves are validating and guiding and I guess moving us toward that self, that eventual reality of who we can be. And I think at our best, we will be a people who want that in others as well, right?
Yeah.
That our values are the values that we hold as people and as a society. Hopefully, as we embrace our whole selves, those values are upheld and are highlighted more and more.
Yeah.
And I think I think we see that a little bit in the way that Locke is, and I think that is eventually a kingdom reality that we're going to live into.
Yeah, agreed. And so that's why I'm hopeful, and I think the story, I think Michelle and the writers are asking us to be hopeful for Mullen and Locke. And generally in Star Trek, when we're invited to hope, it leads us to something good. So
right.
And this has been a very Star Trek. Star Trek Discovery has always felt like Star Trek to me. I know there are so many people who vilified it for so long, and it's always bothered me because it's such good Star Trek. It's just so Star Trek-y. It's just this again, like the style versus the ethos. Like the style may be different, but the ethos is there,
right?
And so but I've really felt that lately. In the stories and the kinds of stories that we're telling and the kinds of themes that we're talking about, I feel like it's been very essential Star Trek. And even in Jeff Russo's score for this season, I have been really swept up into the music and going, man, this is Star Trek-y music. Like, this is so good. It's so rich, and it's been beautiful, and I love it. I'll be sad to see Discovery go.
Well, did you love Whistlespeak?
I did. Do you want to talk about Whistlespeak?
I'd love to talk about Whistlespeak.
Let's talk about it. Let's speak with our. How did you? We'll just do the rest of the episode in whistles. We'll just.
Oh boy, I don't know if my microphone will pick it up.
What did you tell me? What you made of this episode?
Okay, so first of all, I think Kovich is definitely going back in time to buy legal pads at Staples.
I think he is too.
he says he has his ways or has his means or whatever.
Right.
He's using real paper, and that's definitely just like a random legal pad from Staples.
Yes.
I think that he's like coming back in time to 2024 and just like nonchalantly, like, I mean, he already wears clothes that would fit in pretty well in our modern society, right?
Right.
He just walks into a Staples, and maybe, I don't know, do you think he actually buys it and pays for it, or do you think he just like grabs a pack off the shelf and transports back to the 32nd century? But I think he's definitely using time travel to get this.
Yeah, I think he's like Doc Brown. He's got a suitcase full of money from different eras and different planets, and he goes and buys the stuff, and then he goes and sells these things on some weird 32nd century office supply nerd black market, and he's making a killing. That's how he gets those snazzy ties.
Right. Oh, that's a good point. Yep. I got Post-its. I got a whole pack, and I'm selling them for 35 credits.
I got pink. I got blue. I got green. Where did you find these? I have my ways. Oh dear. You have this secret transporter location that you. Anyway, sorry. I'm just. We could do this whole fan fiction about Kovich selling office supplies. But anyway.
What'll you give me for one pack of Scotch tape?
Look at this. Sticky and clear. Anyway, okay. But moving on.
I did love the fact that you can learn so much about people by their speech.
Yes.
Burnham makes a big deal about this, about how you can learn about people by the way that they talk, and she talks about how they have multiple words for pain, but no words for class differences.
Right.
And just the way that she sort of expresses in their speech the way that you can understand these people.
Yeah.
In Star Wars, in the sort of, not in the movies, but in the extended universe, there's a character, Grand Admiral Thrawn, and he thinks that the way that you can learn about people the best is by their art. And I thought that was a very similar sort of, what Burnham is talking about here is a very similar sort of idea, but I think even maybe more deep at a deeper level. I love the idea that, like, not only do they have one way of speaking, they have two ways of speaking, and one of them, apparently whistle speaking is a real thing in the real world. There are there is this sort of thing, but
yes,
I just think that that's fantastic that that they're really coming to this really deep level of how do you understand somebody, and talking about how you can really understand a culture, a people, by how they talk to each other.
Yes, and language is so important to our development, right?
Yes.
As a species and as individuals. And so, you know, in the past, when people with various communication differences were not able to have a language, then they had a lot harder time learning and growing, because we need a language to think in.
Right. Yeah.
And so when you learn about someone's language, you learn about how they think, because that's literally like the coding of their brain. So that you have, and the more you learn about where words come from, and then where the words they come from, the more you kind of trail together breadcrumbs of meaning. So this is at least a bilingual culture, right? Which we don't normally have in Star Trek.
Right.
And to have that represented, and then I just think it'd be interesting to think about that particular aspect of this culture, and then ask questions about how that simple fact of their existence might help us understand the way they think and act within the episode. That's a whole study, but anyhow. But yeah. So yeah, tell us more.
Well, so my, I guess, short review of the episode, and again, I'm not calling this my favorite episode of the series for sure, probably not even of the season, but I do love these smaller scope episodes, these smaller scope missions. You know, this is just fix the weather on a pre-warp planet,
right?
Know? And then it gets even smaller, because they solve that at like the 2/3 mark, right? It's just save Tilly and save the kid, right? And
right.
That's it. That's all there is, you know. And can we do this without breaking the Prime Directive? I mean, no, but those are the stakes, right? And they have to make a hard decision.
Yeah.
And Burnham decides that it's worth it. So I think it's really interesting that here we are in this last season, and yes, there is a big, huge problem at hand, right? But we're not every episode dealing with the end of civilization and trying to stave off, the dark matter anomaly or whatever. We're just dealing with fixing the weather on this pre-warp planet.
Yeah.
And that doesn't even have to be done today. Like, we can do this. We need to do it soon, but we can do this at any point over the next couple of years, and they'll be fine.
Right.
I thought that it was fantastic that we're stepping back into these questions, these really thoughtful questions that we really can spend time talking about and spend time thinking about, because they're not dire. But that means that we get to explore all of the little nooks and crannies of them. And kind of like what I was talking about, how I like time loop episodes earlier. It gives us the opportunity to really look at a problem from all sides, because we aren't compressed into the time of like, we got to do this now or the universe will rip in half, and that would be bad, right?
Yeah.
Like we have to go through everything has to be so breakneck a lot of times, that it's nice to be able to slow down, and not that this is a slow episode, like,
right.
it has good pacing, it's really thoughtful, but the stakes are much more manageable. We can wrap our heads around them, and I think that's beautiful. I think that's fantastic that they've hit their stride to the point where they're willing to do episodes like this.
Well, and the stakes are not just manageable; they're personal, right?
Yeah,
because the stakes
for sure.
in this episode, the ultimate stakes, are really, even though there are kind of planetary stakes and survival stakes in terms of getting this system up and running, or at least applying the maintenance necessary, to get this fixed, and fix it, and keep it fixed in the future. But it's also it's Tilly's life,
right?
And it's Rava's life. And it's not even the entirety of Halemno. It's we're just so often on Star Trek. It's like, why is the entirety of this planet this one village? And like, for once we have an answer for that.
Right. Yeah.
Well, all the other villages died. All the other countries died. Whatever. And but now, now that they have this knowledge, they can give life back to the whole planet. I mean, there's so much. There's so much there, and I think that's beautiful. But yeah, it is a smaller story, but it's and that's what I love about the structure of this season, is that Discovery has long had episodic stories that it's told, even as it's done these long arcs. But it's largely been focused on these long arcs, especially as we get into season 3 and 4. But the first season was a little more episodic than some others. But yeah, we're really balancing these two, because we're on this quest. It's almost like a fantasy novel. We're on this quest, but we have all these people we encounter along the way, and all these things we have to do along the way toward our larger goal. Which it works really nicely and gives us some good episode structures like this, which I really enjoy.
Yeah, for sure. And as I was saying like earlier, like I love that they're able to take the time to have these deep conversations, because this episode goes really, really, really deep. It's talking about really big questions like the nature of religion and the morality of sacrifice.
Yeah.
And I think that this is all just really ripe for not just thinking about, but like our discussion specifically.
Yeah.
So I'm intrigued to hear what you think about this discussion between Ovaz and Burnham. They're right at the end of the episode. I wrote it down. Ovaz asks, "Does all this mean, are there no gods? What is there?" And Michael says, "There is still what you believe. Nothing we've shown you means gods don't exist, or that the journey of the Mother Compeer didn't happen. It's just that now there is also us.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Well, and there's more to what she says there too.
Oh yeah, we'll get there.
Okay. So, all right. Yeah, no, I love that. I absolutely love that. And I was thinking about this earlier today, actually, because this is the kind of episode that is very much, like I said, this season has felt very Star Trek, and this is a very Star Trek story where we happen upon this technologically limited, not just pre-warp, but technologically limited society that is deeply and even like systematically religious. Like like the religion is so much a part of their culture that it's just intrinsic. It's like the bedrock of their civilization.
Right.
And it turns out that this religion is not built by gods, but is built by beings and is run by machines. So it's the Apple, it's the Return of the Archons, right?
Right.
And what we generally do in the original series is break the machine, free the people, and, they'll figure it out.
Right.
Right?
Right.
And, okay, in this, though, the people are really dependent for their lives on the machine running.
Right.
And even if it wasn't placed, and it wasn't placed here by gods, it was placed here by Denoblians. And let's just hope they're not gods, because actually they might make a pretty good universe. But anyhow, they're pretty kind people, I think. They love everybody. But still, and I think it's wonderful that they did this. But still, we know that it's not gods who have created this. And so I think the Kirk answer, the Kirk thing would be, if they had to reveal the technology, obviously this is not one of those circumstances where we have to free them from the technology, because the technology is actually beneficial in this case.
Right.
And that's unusual. Usually the technology and the religion are oppressive. Yeah. Now, granted, there's this sacrifice involved.
Right.
That's not beneficial. We don't like that so much.
Yeah. So I think I was of two minds about this, because you're right. There's this is definitely not the way Kirk would have done it. Or,
right.
Well, I don't know about definitely. It doesn't feel the same as an original series episode.
What Kirk would have done in some way or another is say there are no gods.
Right.
He would have torn down the gods one way or another. And that's something we've talked about before as beneficial when the gods are false. To tear down false gods, that's iconoclasm. That's a Christian tradition, sort of thing. But at the same time, are these gods beneficial or not? And it seems like they actually kind of are.
We also have the opposite. I don't know about opposite. We've got another. I guess, opposite. The opposite reaction of a Federation crew to the sincere beliefs of a society. You see that in the Bajoran religion, and in the way that Sisko, I guess Sisko might not be the best example here because, of the all the stuff, but the way that the Bajorans, the way that the Federation reacts to the Bajorans' worship of the prophets,
right?
Which the show kind of gets around the question of whether or not they're false gods by allowing the prophets to still be a little bit transcendent, right? They're still a little bit now. So this episode provides an interesting middle ground because it's showing us a world where the things that they are attributing to the gods are not directly caused by the gods, right? There's a more concrete cause, at least, of the sort of blessings that these people have on Halimno. But it's also not going quite so far as to say that they're definitely gods or in any way transcendent, because they are just Denobulans, and we spent 4 seasons with one on Enterprise, and he's not a god.
No.
Right? So we've got this sort of interesting middle ground where we're actually not just saying definitely atheism, and we're not just saying definitely, your beliefs are whatever, but we're actually having to wrestle with it a little bit. And I liked that she was saying that what we see here, none of it obviates the truth of God. I agree. I think that's, obviously, I wouldn't be doing this Star Trek podcast, the Gospel According to Star Trek podcast, if I didn't agree that nothing in Star Trek obviates the truth of God.
Right.
But I felt like it was insufficient. And not insufficient in the way that, like, oh, well, they just didn't have time to get to it. It seems like Burnham was encouraging Ovaz to just add the understanding of the Federation and sort of the world beyond, extraterrestrial, extra helemnoestrials,
right?
to his current understanding of gods as some sort of cosmic, like, syncretism, I guess. But I think that the reality is huge. It's much greater than that. The truth or fiction of aliens isn't just a thing that you add to the end of the story or alongside the story as sort of a sidebar. You don't have to hold two opposing things in your mind at once. I think that the truth or fiction of aliens, at least in our world and our Christian understanding of it, is a part of the story of God. It's not just like some adjacent tale. Mm-hmm. And we sort of see the way that Obaz is taking that. He is taking it as being somewhat syncretistic, because he says that later on that perhaps devotion means being able to hear when the gods tell us something new.
Right.
He's hearing this as the gods saying something new. But if our God is eternally consistent, which I believe he is, then the God who stopped Abraham from willing Isaac, or from killing Isaac rather, and condemned other neighboring peoples for human sacrifices, also doesn't want us to sacrifice the lives and well-being of people today, poor people, trans people, on the altar of his name. You know, he will provide a sacrifice, and that sacrifice is Jesus. This is all a part of the same story. It's not just adding on to the end of the story or adding a sidebar beside the story. It's part of the story. It's already existing. And as you were talking about in our discussion of mirrors, you know, education is not separate from intellectual intellectual pursuits are not separate from spiritual pursuits. Education and spiritual growth are connected. And Tilly makes that same argument. I think that we have to not just talk about these things as separate stories that can somehow exist simultaneously despite being in some ways incompatible. No, they're not coexisting incompatible stories. They are the same story, but different parts of the same story. They're expressing the same truth about who God is.
Yeah, I think that's true, but I don't think Burnham's response to Ovaz is really necessarily saying that their presence is incidental, because she says, "Look, you know, yes, aliens, you know, gave you the towers, right? But
Sure.
that doesn't mean that they weren't sent by gods, that there wasn't something divine motivating them. That doesn't mean there wasn't something divine motivating us, you know? Right. I don't know. And what I find interesting about this episode too is it's a little bit of a microcosm of this whole season, because the season is about the progenitors who seed humanoid life throughout the galaxy. And here we have a planet on which life as they know it exists and has been sustained because of unseen alien visitors who deposited something that contributed to their flourishing and that kept them alive. And also, they're going to continue from now on because these other alien visitors came and fixed that and taught them how to fix it and prolonged their lives. And so, in the first instance, they have made these aliens into divine beings. And in the second instance, they might be having to learn that, you know, maybe this is the answer of where we come from in a certain sense. But maybe it's not that, you know, like these aliens are gods. Maybe it's that there's got to be, where do these aliens come from?
Right.
Why did this happen in this way?
Right.
why were we given this gift through these aliens? And so again, you go back and you're peeling the onion looking for the first cause.
Right.
And I think that's, and it also says, look, there are practical considerations about why things are the way they are. And yet it's totally good and fine and right and whatever to look for something greater that causes those practical realities to exist.
Right.
And
right.
there's nothing wrong with that. And I really, really resonated with the idea that, perhaps, and it's Ovaz's line, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Where he says, perhaps devotion means being able to hear when the gods tell us something new.
Right.
I think that's the Christian story. If you look at the scriptures, that's the story of God's relationship with people, is people constantly thinking they have God figured out and then figuring out they don't have God figured out. And God teaching us new things over and over and over again. And we exclude the Gentiles, and we exclude the eunuchs, and we exclude the women. And God comes along throughout Scripture, and even though there are scriptures that ban all those people, then later in Scripture, God comes along and says, nope, those people are included. Nope, those people are included. Nope, those people are included.
And I think that what you're saying is Ovaz says something new, but I think maybe that's the thing that maybe rubs me the wrong way, and Burnham sort of leads him to that this is a new thing,
right?
But God is the same,
right? Well,
that's what He's always been, right?
It's new, but it's new to you, right?
Yes,
so there's a saying that I quote all the time from Fred Rogers, which is, you learn something old every day.
Right.
Because the way people normally say it is you learn something new every day. But the truth is it's only new to you. It's actually probably old, whatever it is you're learning.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is the reason. One of the reasons I say that is I think that's really true about revelation. What the revelation of God that comes to us is throughout Scripture and as we live our lives is we are learning something old. Something older than all of us, because we're learning deeper truths of who God is and what God wants. And what God gets when God gets everything God wants, right?
Yeah.
And so, so calling it something new is not is just a perception, right? A perception of the same thing. It's new to us, but that's just because so my favorite film of all time is The Last Temptation of Christ, and Jesus is having a confrontation, and that's fictionalized, right? But Jesus is having a confrontation with the teachers of the law and the elders. And he's saying, God doesn't need sacrifices. He doesn't need shekels. He doesn't need cypress trees, And he says, I'm the end of the old law and the beginning of the new one, And the priest says to him, what? Has God changed his mind about the old law? And Jesus says, no. He just thinks our hearts are ready to hold more, that's all. And I think that is what it is. That to me is a great encapsulation of the story we see time and time again in Scripture, and the story we are seeing right now in our own religious structures, where we have tried to hold on to certain ways of doing things, certain people we're supposed to exclude, and all those things. And as Nadia Bolz-Weber says, we're so concerned with, who belongs under the tent, and we forget that it's God's tent. God tells us who belongs under the tent. It's not up to us.
Right.
And what happens time and time again in Scripture, and what we've seen time and time again since the Scriptures have been written, is that those who were on the outside are constantly brought into the inside. Because God's tent really does encompass everybody. And it's that kind of learning. And it's learning that, hey, we could actually hold different views of communion. You can believe in transubstantiation, and I cannot believe in transubstantiation, and we can still have communion with one another. We don't have to be at war. those kinds of changes, that kind of growth, that's the story of divine revelation in our history. Yeah. And I think we're seeing it in real time right now. And that's what I think is beautiful about this episode. One of the things that's beautiful about this episode.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think talking about just different expressions of religion and sort of the way that we misunderstand, right? Ovaz goes on to, in that conversation that I was talking about earlier, to talk to Burnham in a way that I think underscores a lot of those questions. He says, "What do I say to my people? The sacrifices unite us. They help us see a common purpose. I fear how my people will react if we take this away so suddenly.
Yeah.
In the past, attempts to stop the sacrifices have been met with violence and upheaval." And Burnham replies, "You are wise to consider that. But there are those among you who seem ready to move beyond the sacrifices. The woman you healed, Honora, she finds order in your people's commitment to one another. She told me the sacrifices aren't necessary to bring one closer to the gods. Maybe others are ready to understand that too. Beliefs can evolve. Denying that can cause almost as much chaos as the worst storm."
Yeah.
So sort of what you were talking about with learning and understanding better who God is. But I think also this gets to an interesting question too of sacrifice, right?
Yeah.
And is sacrifice moral? Is it divine? When does it become not divine? Pretty much every culture values sacrifice in some way, right? But when does sacrifice become not moral? I think you've got sort of two views of sacrifices here, right?
Right.
You've got that sort of like the, I guess, Orthodox Helenites view of like, we send the people up there, the race happens, and we send the people into the temple, and they are sacrificed, their breath is taken, and the rains come. And then you've got the reformer Helenites, maybe, who like Honora, and eventually I think Ovaz, who say things like, well, I guess Ovaz actually says this even beforehand. How could I be selfish when all our people suffer for each other? And that calls back to Honora saying, if I didn't, someone else would have needed to do it, basically, which is talking about taking the dust off of an orchard. They are already sacrificing for each other.
Yeah.
Even before they make it to the top of the weather tower. They're just making this. They're formalizing a thing maybe that isn't necessarily formal. So I wanted to talk a little bit about sacrifice and whether sacrifice is divine, whether it's immoral, and at what point it becomes immoral.
I think sacrifice in the sense that we have seen in the Bible, in the sense that we see in this episode, particularly when we're talking about sacrificing sentient beings of our own species.
Right. Yeah.
I think at least, what we would call human sacrifice is obviously detestable.
Right. Yes.
But I think the concept of killing to please a god, is something I think humanity has mostly grown beyond. I was talking about earlier about
right.
Jesus saying our hearts are ready to hold more in the last temptation of Christ.
Right.
I think that's what Jesus says in the Gospels, that our hearts are ready to hold more. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Right. And so this is God teaching people who God really is when they're ready to grow past this understanding of a God who wants bloodshed.
Right.
And I think in Jesus, and I mean, there are different ways to view atonement. There are different ways to view the death of Jesus. I mean, I'm not trying to say this is the only way, but I do think that in Jesus, in the story of Jesus' crucifixion, we learn that it's really we who want the shedding of blood. We're the ones who sacrifice the one who God sent to teach us how to live.
Well, and I mean, if we're going to talk about when a sacrifice is no longer moral, we have to talk about when it is moral, why?
Right.
Why is it? Why do we consider it to be moral?
Well, and I don't know that at this point we ever would. At least that kind of blood sacrifice.
Not altar sacrifices, but like just life sacrifice.
Yeah.
I am choosing to not do this thing for the sake of another.
Right.
And I think absolutely one of those things is that it is a our hearts are made to echo with the story of God and the story that he is writing. Mm-hmm. And part of that is echoing when we do something or we see something that is like Jesus.
Yeah.
And his sacrifice on the cross is something that echoes in a lot of we see Christ-like things. You wrote about this, we see Christ-like things all over Star Trek and all over the Bible and all over, or not just the Bible, all over literature in general, right?
Yeah.
But I think the other thing too is that it elevates God's people, as in the community, above one individual. And again, how could I be selfish when all our people suffer for each other?
Yes.
That's such a beautiful way of expressing a thing that I think is sort of lost in a Western understanding of Christianity. That there is more to our experience of God than we can have individually.
Yes, and that the communal experience is necessary.
Yes,
right? It's necessary from a spiritual standpoint, but it's necessary from a human standpoint. We are both individuals and communal beings. We need both aspects. Yes. We need both our faces. To reference the previous episode, right? We need both of ourselves, our public self and our private self. Star Trek is so much about duality and about balancing dualities. And one of the dualities that is constantly being balanced in Star Trek is the individual and the community. And that's always, and that's what this conversation comes to the core of. And when we talk about what sacrifice is like morally good, I think of actually the 2009 film when Spock is in the quiz bowl, and and we get the answer, but we don't get the question. And I kind of did some digging and figured out that the question is, what is a supererogation? Because his answer is, when an action is morally praiseworthy but not morally necessary. I think that was it, or not morally required. Right. So in other words, when you're doing something that is more than the call of duty, when you're doing something that is more than the baseline of what morality asks of you, it's morally praiseworthy, but it's not like the necessary moral. It's like it's above and beyond. That's a supererogation. And I think that's the kind of sacrifice that is the best kind when we give of ourselves to others. Remember, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. In other words, I don't desire that you kill for me. What I desire is that you give of yourself out of mercy.
Right.
Right. So the sacrifice that God really wants, the sacrifice that doesn't just like please the deity on high, right? But that leads to our flourishing, because this is how we are built to function, is sacrifices that are acts of mercy, sacrifices that are acts of kindness, sacrifices that lead to flourishing. And that's kind of, for me, kind of the ethic. It's like, does it lead to flourishing? Is it an act of love? And so now sacrificing again, and this is true. I've seen this in my own life. You can sacrifice and sacrifice and sacrifice for others, thinking this is my duty as a Christian. I have to give of myself to others. But if you're giving of yourself to the point that you are depleted and you are harmed, you deserve mercy too. Yeah. And you have to be whole to give to others. So this comes to a beautiful picture I want to talk about in this episode, if that's all right.
Yeah.
We're
your podcast.
Yeah, but conviviality, right? But we're on the race. Tilly and Rava are the last two, and Rava spills their bowl.
Yeah,
there's no more water in the bowl; it's gone. And Ovaz says to them, "Hey, that was a noble race. You did great. Basically, I'm proud of you, but you can't finish the race with an empty bowl."
Right.
And Tilly starts to go on, and then she's like, nah. And she turns around and pours some of the water from her bowl into Rava's bowl.
Mm-hmm.
And then they go on together.
Yeah.
And the community surrounds them and celebrates. Both of them.
Right. Right.
And I find that so beautiful in so many ways.
Mm-hmm.
One of them is Jesus' words, if anyone gives a cup of cold water to one of these because they are my disciple, they will surely not lose their reward. Right.
Right.
I just thought of that when I saw that moment.
Mm-hmm.
Giving of what you have to someone else.
Right.
Or if you have 2 shirts, give away one.
Right.
And you see somebody in need, give what you can. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Give out of what you're able to give. Because
Right.
Tilly still has water in her bowl.
Mm-hmm.
She's got to go too, but she gives what she can.
Right.
And that's enough.
And it's also worth noting that, like, at this point, she doesn't know the end of this.
Right.
Tilly
Of
doesn't
course.
know the end
Right.
of this. And so it's important to realize that, like, as far as Tilly is aware, once they get up there,
You're right.
the everything sort of falls into place, and they're
going to be fine.
They're going to be fine. So not only is she, like, helping Rava to accomplish their goal, but she's also, I guess, in a way, as far as she's concerned, contributing to both of their flourishing,
Right.
By that sharing.
Right.
And that's one of those things that I think in a lot of cases we discount. We think that there's something less moral or less noble about giving when we also benefit from it.
Right.
But no, it doesn't become less giving or less noble or less beautiful if it also helps us. The sacrifice is not in us being miserable. The sacrifice is in us allowing ourselves to not have as much in order for another person to flourish.
Yeah. Yeah. That's absolutely right. And I think we can, people are going to give in ways that they are called to and that they are equipped for.
Uh-huh.
And if you're looking for those ways to give, then that's good. You don't have to say, well, this person is living in absolute poverty to give to other people.
Right.
That's good. That's their calling. Do what you can. Do what you're able to so that you can continue to give. Whatever you have needs to be for, you and your family's flourishing, but also for the flourishing of the community around you. And focusing on both of those things is how you're able to keep giving. How you're able to keep giving. Rich Mullins, famously, he was a musician, Christian market musician. If you don't know him, check him out. He died many years ago. But he was a genius songwriter and brilliant person.
Yes.
Very, very strange and flawed person, but just this really weirdo, and I love him.
Eccentric iconoclast.
Absolutely. But he famously did not ever know how much money he made in his music career.
Right.
Because everything that he had was donated. I think especially if not entirely to Native peoples. And he lived on a teacher's salary.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's great. That's a beautiful image of making sure you have enough for what you need and then making sure others have enough for what they need and just giving what it is you're called to give. And that's going to look different for different people. So yeah. And I think you're right that a sacrifice does become immoral, not just when you're killing in God's name, but if you're killing yourself in God's name.
Yeah.
You are precious to God too. And you have to remember that and live like you matter.
Right.
Even as love is in humility considering others better than yourselves. Doing nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Look, providing for your own self and your own flourishing is not selfish ambition or vain conceit.
Right.
Right?
Yes. Selfish ambition and vain conceit is wanting to have $1 billion when everyone else is struggling to get by,
Right.
or wanting to devote all of your time to maximizing your follower count on Instagram while people are having troubles in your next door to you.
Right.
I think that this is sort of a little bit gotten at when Tilly and Rava are talking, and they say, "What? Maybe the gods will figure out a way to save us." Which echoes so much Abraham and Isaac. God will provide a sacrifice, but I think that also comes to sort of reflect maybe the hope and the faith of knowing the character of a God who came for our flourishing, a God who came that we would have an abundant life.
Yeah.
And the recognition that he has in mind for us a greater and better flourishing than we can come up with for ourselves. Mm-hmm. And so if we are sacrificing for others, for the sake of others, he will provide a way to fill us up again. We also see that in Job. We see that actually, frankly, all over the Bible.
Yeah.
When people pour themselves out for God, he fills them back up again.
Yeah.
And so it's not treated as a noble or a good thing that they pour themselves out and are left completely desolate and completely empty.
Right.
Even if they do die in the course of sacrificing themselves for the sake of others, they are given a reward in both legacy and in eternity. And I thought that was a really cool way of expressing that as well.
Yeah, when the good stuff comes your way, don't assume you don't deserve it.
Yeah.
Right? You know, and don't look for, don't be waiting for lightning from heaven, right? You know?
Right. Yeah.
Recognize the divine and the mundane, so that you're not like the person on the roof of their house, praying to be saved from the flood, and rejecting the boats and rejecting the helicopter because God will save them, and then they die and they ask God, "Why didn't you save me?" And God says, "Well, I sent boats and I sent a helicopter."
Or like Burnham, at least as expressed by Book there at the end of the episode. He talks about how it's an odd quirk, a human tendency to consider something less meaningful if it's just for yourself.
Yeah.
How she feels like if she's not experiencing something with somebody else, it's less of a thing. Mm-hmm. She has to share it, or else it's not real.
Yeah.
And it contributes to this loneliness that he says is her oldest friend.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, there's nothing in our world that isn't made better by experiencing with others. Like, we're made for community, even if it's just a community of two. That's not an odd quirk. That's just who we are. Like, this is who we are supposed to be, who we are made to be.
Yeah.
And she has denied herself that because she doesn't think. Well, I guess for many, many reasons, right? But she's expressing the famous or the famous Vulcan philosophy. I assume probably it came from Sirach. Everything came from Sirach, right? But the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one.
Mm-hmm.
The Burnham is allowing herself to be lonely. Burnham is eschewing these relationships, and in a lot of cases, and we're starting to see her come out of that. But we see through Book like this expression of like she's sacrificing her community with others for the sake of what, right? But I think that he's really pressing it here to point out that like this sort of meaning, this sort of communal experiencing of other things is a part of what it means to be human, and it's a part of a beautiful understanding of who we are as human beings, to understand things together. And I don't think that it is a moral thing to eschew that in favor of some sort of I don't know,
isolated
whatever
existence.
It is Burnham is doing. Yeah, to have an isolated existence, to pursue holiness somehow on your own, as if that were even possible. Right. So I think you're absolutely right on there. God finds a way to fill us up, sometimes in the facts and in the ways that we interact with other people.
Mm-hmm.
sometimes in the ways that we are just sort of interacting with him or experiencing him, and sometimes in the ways that we find to fill ourselves back up. But you're right, flourishing as a community necessarily or necessitates our personal flourishing as well.
Yes, absolutely. And we don't, it's interesting because we don't really grow together as a community if we're not growing as individuals. And we don't grow as individuals unless we're invested in community.
Right.
We need both aspects of ourselves. We need...
It's almost like we're whole people and
not these little fragments we try to make ourselves into. It's almost like if we deny half of ourselves, we deny all of ourselves. Somebody...
Yeah, I really did not expect the Breen to be such a big part of this episode.
I know.
But for sure.
It's crazy. Man, Breen wisdom. It's good. I like it. I love this episode. There's so much to talk about.
Oh, yeah.
But I think we've given it all the coverage we have time for in this episode.
And we have a burning trivia question to answer.
Burning trivia questions to answer. Are you ready for the burning trivia answers?
Oh, I'm ready.
Okay.
I'm ready.
All right, let's do it. Here we go. Mike says, I mean it. No cheating.
Okay, Mike.
Okay. Are you ready to send your answers?
Yes, I am.
All right. 3, 2, 1. Send. Okay. So, question number 1 is, a female member of what species first appeared in the original series episode Day of the Dove? Day of the Dove.
I don't remember Day of the Dove.
Okay. And your
I
answer was?
I answered Vulcan. I had no idea.
With an emphatic question mark.
A very emphatic question mark.
And I answered Klingon. And the correct answer is Klingon. Aha! All right. So that's one point for me. The second question in our Star Trek trivia here is, how does Commander Riker realize he is not really in the future in the Next Generation episode Future Imperfect? Your answer is?
The fake data uses a contraction, which is a plot hole.
Is a plot hole.
It is a plot hole because he uses contractions all over the place.
That's true.
In Encounter at Farpoint.
That's not just a plot hole. That's a cannon hole.
Yes. Yep.
That's right. That's just a thing that has never been true.
I like the double meaning of cannon hole.
I know. I was just thinking that.
That's good. That's good.
Okay. Well, my answer was, he can trip Data up. And I even quoted him, no, you can't, so don't even try. Right? We both were kind of zeroing in on the Data thing, but the answer may surprise both of us. The answer is, he is told that his wife is Minuet, whom he knows to be a holodeck simulation originally created by the Binars.
You're right.
Dang it. Dang it.
Yep.
Dang it. Dang it. Yep. So we both missed that one. We both whiffed. So you're 0-0 and I'm 0-1. Or 1-0 or whatever. I don't know. It's however the sports people say it. Whatever.
Yeah,
okay. So the third and final question is, which actor played the grandfather of his Star Trek The Next Generation character in The Undiscovered Country? The answer we both gave is Michael Dorn, who played Colonel Worf.
The man, the myth, the legend.
The grandfather. So, we both got the third one correct. We both missed the second one, but I came ahead on the first one.
Yes, you did.
I believe the
golden
self-sealing sunboat is this week mine.
Yes, well deserved.
Yep.
Well done.
You can have the silver stem bolt. You will have to seal yourself.
Oh no. I must reach back into my training. I don't know if I remember how to seal a stem bolt.
Oh dear. That's wonderful. All right, and to cap off our conversation here, to cap off our episode, we have yet another audience question. Thank you all for sending in your questions and your comments and all those beautiful things. We love it when you keep in touch with us. Absolutely. And so we had a question here. Kirk found a planet of Native Americans, roughly. What other groups would you have future Starfleet people find? And to make it more interesting, which ones from the Bible would you like to see? We might kind of deal with these separately. Do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, he mentions the group of Native Americans that, natives, I guess, that Kirk finds.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of those actually, though, around Star Trek. We've got some American Indians in Deep Space Nine in the Neutral Zone.
Yeah.
Or I guess they're in Next Generation, and then I think they're also maybe potentially where Chakotay is from in Voyager.
Right.
We've got, I guess if we want to go a little bit slightly goofy, we've got the Voth, which are the evolved Diplodocus, I think.
Oh, right.
That are sort of spirited away to the Delta Quadrant.
Right.
Assignment Earth, I think Gary Seven is a member of a human tribe that is taken to another planet.
Mm-hmm.
In Discovery, we had the last season. We had no, it wasn't last season. It was season 2. We had the Red Angel taking a group of people away during World War III and settling them on. So we have that a lot, where there are people, or I guess beings from Earth, that are sort of taken away to another planet. So, what people from Earth would I like to see?
Yeah, because he's talking about like finding a specific people group,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a in this case a racially specific people group,
right?
And I don't know. So go ahead if you have.
Well, my initial answer is actually not a racial group. It would be Trekkies. I think that it would be. It would be really interesting.
Galaxy Quest.
It would be Galaxy Quest, right? Exactly. It would be really interesting to see all of this sort of come to a sudden reality in the head of somebody. I feel like this would have to be a Lower Decks episode, but something where we historically have had this understanding or this conception of this as fiction, and all of a sudden the scales come off our eyes and we realize that it's true. That just seems immensely fun and satisfying to me. Not the least of which because it would feel like a lot of wish fulfillment as a Trekkie myself, right? So that would be my sort of initial answer. Is not a racial one at all.
Yeah, well, and that's a great answer, but it's a little different than the one I have.
Okay.
So my thing is, I feel like you talked about a lot of different things, but most of them were okay. People were transplanted here, people were transplanted there. Like right. We have the Irish people show up on the ship, and what is it, the Long Ladder? I think it is up the Long Ladder. And I think the thing is, when we look at all these, and even if we kind of extend it to Code of Honor, which is kind of coded, racially, I think anytime, and you go to the
you just mentioned the 2 worst episodes.
I know, right? And 2 of the 4 or whatever 5. But then you go to these ones. Like in the original series where they find the Native Americans or whatever, and the Native Americans in Voyager, and even like Chakotay is just whole character. All this stuff has always been problematic.
Yeah,
always.
Right.
And I don't think it's ever turned out well, and I don't think it's ever been done without people within that group saying, "This is really horrible representation," and without many people outside that group saying, "This is really horrible representation," or "This is at least a deeply cringy episode."
Yeah.
So I just don't think it's a good project. The only way I think we could talk about encountering people from different places, different racial groups or different ethnic groups, or not ethnic, cultural groups or whatever, in Star Trek, is if we went back in time and encountered them or something like that, or if we encountered just going to a planet where people from a specific thing in Earth just somehow exist in a pocket of reality. I mean, even if we're going to, a 1930s gangland planet, or we're going to a planet where the Nazis are in charge or something like that, has always felt kind of, I don't know, cheap to me, just uninteresting and difficult to believe or wrap my head around or accept. And, unless you tell a good story, like Bread and Circuses, I just don't know what the point would be.
So there are other sci-fi franchises that have done this, I think, in a somewhat, I don't know, interesting way. Thinking about Stargate and how they take the idea of Atlantis and they sort of portray it as this other city that sort of is in another galaxy, and there are people that sort of that interacted with Atlantis and interacted with the ancients, and and Norse mythology is involved in some way, and Egyptian mythology, and sort of taking concepts from the past and projecting it into space, concepts from mythology and projecting it into space. I think that's interesting, and I think it could work with some care, right? And I think that modern Star Trek is capable of doing it with that care, and almost certainly like bringing on people who are in that culture or descended from that culture to be able to make sure that it's treated with some care, right?
Yeah.
And so to that end, I think maybe so first of all, I would want it to be somebody from a majority culture. Not I wouldn't want it to be a minority culture in any fashion. So we're thinking early Christians, or we're thinking Romans, if we're talking about from the Bible. We're thinking maybe Jewish people during the sort of the time when David is king and sort of Israel's on top of the world. Maybe potentially that, but certainly also like Egyptians and the Persians. I think any of those groups would be really interesting, and I think you could construct a story where those are where you sort of see a little bit of the humanity behind those characters or behind those cultures, and are able to look at these things in an interesting way. I think there's a way to write a story that is interesting in those things. As you say, time travel is probably a more effective way of doing that. But I think pulling them out of that culture and sort of I guess freezing them into the 37s from Voyager, we sort of get this sort of mix of characters from all over. But in 1937, sort of frozen and then thawed out 100 years later, or not 100 years later, 500 years later, right?
Right.
Or 400 years later. So there's also that possibility of being able to see them interacting with the future world, rather than interacting with future people in the past, interacting with the future world and sort of being on the back foot. And I think that's maybe more interesting when you're talking about a majority culture like the Romans, like early Christians who weren't the majority culture then but are now, like the Persians or the Babylonians or the Egyptians. You sort of see them interacting with the world sort of on the back foot, and I think that might be interesting. What would King Xerxes have thought of transporters and replicators? I think that would be interesting.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. I mean, we have done Romans and early Christians. That was Bread and Circuses.
That's true. That's a good point.
So we have that. But
that was
it's recontextualized.
Convergent development, though, right? That wasn't like that wasn't our Romans and our Christians transplanted into the future. So
right, but I mean, it might as well have been.
Sure.
So for all intents and purposes, and really, it's still, to me, I get the idea of going with a majority culture too, so that you're not possibly denigrating a minority culture. That's
right.
That's a safe choice to make. Unless you have Star Trek as it has tended to be, produced by more marginalized people groups. I mean, that's great. If somebody who's writing Star Trek is from, whatever people group they're from, and they want to write a Star Trek story about their own people, that's the story I want to see.
Yeah, for sure.
I don't really, and I think as you're listing these cultures and these things, I do think it's interesting to see somebody who's powerful kind of, knocked down a little bit. We've seen that dynamic in Star Trek in various ways too.
But we've only ever seen it in sort of like
an alien setting.
Yeah,
but then
and
again, I don't know. I don't know. I like Star Trek better when we're not dealing with subsets of Earth culture. I know that was kind of part of the conception from the beginning, but it was also to save money on production.
That's fair.
I just feel like we can move beyond that at this point. But I think it is. I think for me, like Far Beyond the Stars. Far Beyond the Stars, you've got a Star Trek story that focuses on black urban culture in America in the 1960s.
Right.
Cool. That worked supremely well.
Yes.
That kind of thing that has the deep involvement of somebody like Avery Brooks to make that episode everything it could be, that's when it works.
Let's see something like that written by Tawny Newsome for the Starfleet Academy show.
Sure.
we found out recently, I don't know if we announced it on a podcast, we found out recently that she is writing for Starfleet Academy.
That's right, she is.
So we could conceivably see something like that from her, and I think she'd do a great job.
Yeah. So those kinds of stories, I don't have a wish list. I don't have a desire to say, like, oh, well, let's see this people group or that people group, because it's just not a kind of story I enjoy most of the time. But I think if it's a story that somebody from a particular people group, whether they're marginalized or not, from a particular people group has a way to write a credible Star Trek story that explores or encounters their culture or celebrates their culture in some way, great. That's the story I want to see.
Yeah, I guess the reason that I'm sort of maybe more up on this idea than you are is that I've seen in the RPG gaming space, and actually, I mean, I guess honestly, all over fiction, it's been a subculture for a while, but Afrofuturism, where the idea is African culture or African American culture, but let's imagine what would it be like if not for colonization. And then in the RPG space, actually, I've got the book right over here. There's a game called Coyote and Crow that posits what if European colonialism never reached the shores of the Americas, and so it's Native Americans, but without colonialism. I think that would be a really interesting thing as well. What would I guess we've got Wakanda, right? Like what would a culture of people from a currently colonized place, what would they look like if they had never been colonized? That might be an interesting way of spinning it, and an interesting way to sort of see what Star Trek would do with those people. The Native Americans who were never colonized, or I don't know. It would be interesting to sort of see how would they handle a story about that. Again, I agree. Definitely written by a member of that culture, and sort of produced, I guess, with the involvement of as many people who know as much about that as possible, to give that as much veracity as possible. I would be intrigued to see a story like that, because it works pretty well in those other spaces. Yeah.
It just I've rarely seen that kind of story credibly done in Star Trek, and maybe there's an open door for it, but I just feel like it has to be a story worth telling.
For sure.
and that's what you'd have to convince me of if I'm producing the show. You'd have to convince me it's a story worth telling. Because usually if we go out in space and find some random thing that's exactly like Earth, it's like I just can't go there very, very often. So
yeah. I recognize the not irony, but maybe impropriety of two white folks trying to answer this question.
I tend to agree, and of course, the reason we even ask a question like this is that for all its diversity, Star Trek has until fairly recently tended to be told from a generally white point of view.
Yeah.
So, and that's why,
to the point where it's notable when there are exceptions, like with the Bajorans and such.
And that's probably my biggest problem with telling these types of stories, is that when we go out in space and encounter some person who is basically not contemporary white people, I feel it's very othering, and I feel like it's like, oh, let's look at this weird alien. It just bothers me. And it feels like it's saying we are a really white show, and I don't like that at all. So
I think it bothers you in a good way.
Yeah. I hope
that should bother you.
Yeah, I think so. All right, good. Well, thank you for sending in that question. We always appreciate the engagement. And David, what have we got coming up next week?
Next week, we're going to be discussing Season 5, Episode 7 of Star Trek Discovery, which is called Eriga.
Nice.
Eriga? That's the Breen blood oath thing.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
And depending on how our recording schedule goes, it's a 50-50 shot whether or not we also review Season 5, Episode 8, Labyrinths.
Are you saying we're having trouble getting around to recording single episode reviews?
I'm not saying we're having any trouble at all. This is all according to the plan. We are totally doing this on purpose.
As usual, everything is absolutely...
you run a tight ship.
The tightest you've ever seen.
Yep. You are way more Captain Rayner than Michael Burnham.
Oh, definitely. Well, I'm looking forward to those episodes discussions. And in the meantime, please like and subscribe, comment and share. And if you like what you're hearing, please write a review on iTunes or wherever you're listening. Your reviews help more people find out about the show and let us know how we're doing.
Also, send us your questions. You can find us at Gospel Trek Pod on Twitter, Threads, Instagram, and Mastodon on the 10forward.social server, and The Gospel According to Star Trek on Facebook. Or you can email us at gospeltrekpodcast@gmail.com. We would love to discuss your question on the show.
And you can support the show by clicking the support button on Spotify, or you can follow the link in our show notes or in the descriptions of any of our episodes. Your support helps us keep going, helps us making good content, and eventually we'll hopefully get you some good perks, but we'll definitely keep our warp engines humming. That's going to wrap it up for this edition of the Gospel According to Star Trek podcast. Thank you so much for being here, and until next time.
I'm David Atwell.
And I'm Kevin C. Neeson, as Jesus said in John 10:10, live long and prosper. See you next time.